Welcome to the podcast where we bring on remarkable people to tell their stories.
I'm Paul Gilman.
I'm Daniel Lance.
And this is Pod So 1.
Our guest this week is accomplished restaurateur Joe Carroll, the mind behind several Williamsburg Brooklyn mainstays, including barbecue joint Fette Sau and St Anselm Steakhouse. In this conversation featuring guest host Katy De Koning, we hear from Joe on his pivot from a music career to the restaurant world, and on the creativity with which he approached restaurant concepts, which has now resulted in an impressive empire that now spans cities and states. Joe also reflected on how he handles setbacks and failures. He discussed the new normal with COVID-19 in the restaurant industry, and he even had some thoughts on the future of meat. So here's Joe.
So growing up in Dumont, that's North Jersey?
It is. It's in Bergen County. It's, roughly 10 or so miles north of the GW, George Washington Bridge. And probably roughly the same distance to the New York State border. So we're kind of sandwiched between the city and the state. Which is kind of cool on many levels.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah.
That's exactly how my wife describes where Dumont is. It's X number of miles away from the GW Bridge. She says that every time. Yeah.
Yeah. It's probably the simplest way for anyone who just has a general understanding of the area to know where it is.
So growing up there, are you always in New York City, like high school? When you go out with friends, you go to the city, or nah?
I was a lot. And so my entire family are from the city. My parents both grew up in the Bronx. My grandparents, one of them grew up in the Bronx, but the rest all grew up in Manhattan. And then moved to the Bronx when they got married. So yeah, my family goes back to New York City for pretty much as far back as I know. I mean, obviously they at some point came from England, Ireland and Italy, but they've been, many generations in the city. So growing up, I had a lot of relatives still, not in Manhattan at that point, in the Bronx and in, some areas like Pelham and stuff that, right outside of the Bronx into Westchester. But, so we would go in all the time. And my parents were also pretty cool about taking me into the village and, downtown a lot. And they enjoyed it too. So as a kid, they would take me in quite a bit. And I was always attracted to it. I always gravitated towards it. I was always excited by it. It was pretty, very exciting as a kid to come in and the buildings and the people and the energy and all of it. And I think being into music as a kid too really got me excited to go into the city because that's where all the concerts were and the shows were and the musicians lived and, the whole scene was happening.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that makes total sense.
By the time I was, probably in 8th grade, freshman year, somewhere around there, I would come in with my friends. We would take the bus in and walk around. And then, the moment I always kind of joke because the first chance my parents had, they got out of the city, and the first chance I had, I got back into the city. So,
Isn't that always the way?
Right. So I went there for
fingertips.
college and stayed.
Where'd you go to college?
NYU.
Oh, okay, great.
What'd you major in?
So I went to, I was in a college within the university called Gallatin that allowed me to kind of create my own major, which was pretty great for me. So my focus was musicology. So essentially music history, right? And music business. They had a music business program there. So I was able to kind of do both of those programs. If you were to study them at, a degree in either, would have been in different schools within the university. So the only way to have done both was to do it through this one school that allowed you to, I could take classes in all of the undergraduate schools in the university. There was no restrictions as to what classes I could or couldn't take or what schools I couldn't take classes in or any of that,
All schools should be that way, right?
It was pretty cool. Yeah, I couldn't imagine doing it a different way. I had no core requirements other than a certain amount of classes within my college that I was in. And I had to pass an oral exam based on 24 books in order to graduate. But other than that, it was really pretty great.
How hard was the oral exam? That sounds really, really hard.
It was intense. It was 12 kind of classic text that you were required to read, and the other 12 were, they kind of gave you categories that you could pick books and get them approved and then submit it. And it was 4 faculty members. So it was like my advisor and 3 other faculty members that you get to invite them to come in. So you know, it's not random. You get to kind of pick who you wanted there. And it was 3 hours. It was an hour and a half, and then like a 20-minute break, and then another hour and a half. It was intense.
Of just speaking that whole time?
Just speaking, yeah, about all these books.
Gosh.
Yeah.
So more intense than this podcast.
Probably a little bit, not much though.
Oh, that gives me so much anxiety. I don't think I could do that. I'm like sweating just thinking about it.
It's all right. You know, you basically, when you're in that school at NYU, you're basically preparing for it from the moment you start. You know, you're kind of focused on it. You know that that's coming, and so it wasn't as hard. I was freaked out, I think, initially, you know, when I first got into college, that this was looming. But by the time it came, it was fine. It really wasn't that bad.
Rewinding a little bit, you mentioned that growing up, you'd go into the city to go to shows at different venues. What are the most memorable that you like stand out in your mind that you went to?
I mean, well, certainly like the early couple ones. So my parents took me in 1979 to see the Bee Gees at Madison Square Garden.
Oh, that's amazing.
And that was pretty mind blowing. You know, I was not just about turning 9, and you know, I knew the Bee Gees. You know, of course, Saturday Night Fever had come out, and I knew who they were and all. But it was pretty, you know, it was pretty impressive for a 9-year-old kid, and you know, back then.
Definitely.
And then a year later, they took me to the Garden to see Yes in the round, and that really kind of blew the lid off things. That was sort of the, you know, the start of it all. After that show, that really just kind of messed with my mind to the point where like I knew that I had a problem with music. Like this was going to be a lifelong addiction, you know.
Do you play instruments?
I do. Not so much these days that often anymore, but I did. I started playing in about 3rd or 4th grade. I started with saxophone and drums and guitar. I eventually settled on bass. So by the time by the time I met Lisa in 6th grade, I was playing bass mostly, and I played through college really. But I think I think I was a little probably too practical for my own good at that point. Plus, my dad was a booking agent, but he wasn't a booking agent of, you know, hugely successful bands. He booked like bars and clubs and lounges and stuff all throughout New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania. And I think my parents and myself didn't want to see me playing like in a lounge band when I was in my 30s or something. So I was, I think I was a little too logical about being a musician. If you're going into the arts like that, you can't be too logical. You can't be too practical. You have to kind of go for it, you know? So I think I knew early on that like my chances of making it big were probably small. So maybe I don't bother, you know?
Yeah.
And that's why I gravitated towards the business side of stuff.
Cool. So explain what you kind of did like in the back end of things.
In the music business?
Yeah.
So mainly I worked for about a decade in the industry, and for the majority of the time I worked for a trade magazine called Hits Magazine that are still around today. But at the time back then, they were a very powerful magazine. These magazines, there's a handful of them, and they came out of an older kind of function. They were called reporters. And what they would do is they would weekly report new sales figures and ads at radio. So any new songs that were getting added at radio and their positioning. So they were kind of the original charts, but really not for the public, for the industry. But this was done by picking up the phone and calling radio and calling retail and asking, what's selling? What did you play this week? What's on your playlist? What have you added? So it doesn't take much to realize how corruptible that is. And that's where, you know, the whole payola thing comes from. And it really came down to relationships. And these people were being paid by the record companies for their relationships with program directors at radio and people at retail to then sort of funnel that money through to them to say or do the things that they needed said and done. Billboard magazine by the late 80s, I think, had kind of started with these other companies two ways of going about this in a much more legit fashion. One was called SoundScan, where the product at retail when it would be scanned with the barcode, would register. So it'd be a little bit more difficult to fudge. Although it did get fudged, people would go in after hours and just scan over and over and over cases of whatever they needed scanned. At radio, even to this day, everything that gets played at radio or on MTV, although I don't think MTV actually plays videos anymore, but back then they did, has a digital fingerprint. So whenever it gets played at radio, it gets tracked in a computer as to, you know, what song, at what station, at what time, and what market, all that stuff gets logged. So that's called BDS, Broadcast Data Systems. So that made it a little more difficult by the 90s to really mess with stuff and fudge these numbers. So by the time I got there, that end of the business had stopped a little bit, not completely. I worked a lot with Sony Music at Columbia Records, and you know, anytime a program director was having a baby, that new baby monitors got shipped out, and you know, Sony Electronics would always get shipped out, and PlayStations and all that stuff. So it was a little more subtle form of it, but it still happened all the time, you know.
Sure. Yeah.
So initially, I worked for this magazine on a computer program that they had that combined this broadcast data system, BDS data, and SoundScan data, along with their own still reporting data, where people would just pick up the phone and call. It gave them real time. Every Tuesday at radio are the new ads for the week. So every Tuesday was a big deal, and it would kind of come through like almost like a stock ticker. I did that for a number of years, and eventually wrote for a column and worked. Now the magazine was based in Sherman Oaks, out in the Valley in California. I was here in New York, but I wrote for a column called Wheels and Deals. That was basically who was getting signed, who was getting attention from record labels, what bands were getting shopped by various lawyers or whatever. So that was a weekly column, and I was kind of the ear to the street in New York City for them. Did that until I want to say 99 or 2000, and then got hired by a company to do a feasibility study for them on a digital CD player that would live on your computer and track your listening habits. Terrible idea. So I did that for a month or two with them, and then got hired by .com. I was like, I need some of this .com money, you know. But by then, it was post March 2000 crash or whatever, so that it wasn't as great as it had been in the years prior. I got hired by a company called localmusic.com, and it was it's kind of a classic internet story from back then. It was these two kids. They were fresh out of Georgetown. They started this .com that, you know, essentially was like local music. Who's playing in your local area, you know? They took like 2 months to hire me, interview after interview. I was going to run the Northeast office for them. They hired me in October of 2000, and by January of 2001, they were out of business.
Oh, wow.
So that was it. Like, that was the end of my music business days. I went on a handful of interviews, and things had gotten really tough because it was a combination of a lot of the .com stuff kind of going away at that point. You know, it had kind of peaked and started receding. So a lot of the people who had left the traditional end of the industry, the brick and mortar stuff, and went to the internet were now coming back. And I realized that, you know, the job I wanted, or the job I probably should have had by that time at my age, you know, I was competing against people who had 10, 15 years more experience than me. So it was kind of, you know, it was a hard pill for me to swallow. Most of my life up until that point, I always thought I would work with music, in music, around music in some way. So it was weird. I didn't know quite what to do for a little while. I had briefly moved back to Dumont, and I was living in the house I grew up in with my girlfriend, who eventually became my wife at the time. We were living together in Manhattan, and I had a rent stabilized place. Stabilization expired. My rent went up by over $1,000 in one lease. Oof. And realized, all right, I got to figure something out. My parents own a 4-family house in Dumont, so they had an apartment that was available. We went out there, but it was a rough little period in my life. I had just turned 30. I was living back in my parents' house, so to speak, And I kind of realized that my dream of working in music for the rest of my life was probably coming to an end. So it was a little weird period. Although, it opened up other doors and led to other things. So it's interesting how life works like that.
Not quite a middle-age crisis, but maybe a version of that.
Yeah, to a degree. Definitely a wake-up point where I had to rethink my entire life. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to back up real quickly because my wife would be furious if I didn't ask you about your fondest memories of growing up in Dumont.
Sure.
So,
wow. I mean, I think it's just the ability, and I'm not sure if this ability exists anymore, but the ability to just get up as a kid and go out the door and meet my friends on the street and play all day and, not come back home until dinner. And, there was, for better or worse, just a lot of mischief to get into in the suburbs. I feel like I look at my kids now growing up in New York City, and they are at once exposed to much more stuff culturally than I ever was growing up in Dumont. But they also live a bit more sheltered life too, because just go out on the street and play and hang out and do whatever, and they're about to turn 12. And you can't do that in the city so much anymore. I think when my parents were growing up, particularly in the Bronx and those neighborhoods, you could do it because there were so many kids in those buildings. Where we live in North Brooklyn, there are a lot of kids, but it's dispersed. It's not concentrated on one block where, the street I live in has, hundreds of kids, my kids' age, and they all meet up and play on the street. That just doesn't exist like that in the city now. At least not where we live. Yeah,
and 24-hour news, social media scares every mom and dad out there too. So
yeah, that's a part of it, and also just the entertainment part of it, where kids are, they're not as apt to just go out and hang out on the street and play with their friends. I mean, I think if we all grew up with a phone or an iPad in our hands, we probably would have been doing the same a lot too. I'm not sure we would have gotten out as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely true.
But I'm still very close with a group of friends that I have known anywhere from kindergarten through 6th grade. We still see each other quite often. We talk all the time. And it's definitely, I do have really great, although I wanted to leave the moment I could, I do really have great memories of it. Had a great time growing up there.
Yeah, my recollection, since I'm married to a woman from Dumont, is it was 2 square miles. And it was very square, and it just seemed like a fun place to grow up, but not too exciting, but also not boring or bad in any way.
No, it was an interesting town, a very densely populated town, 2 square miles, but probably 30-something thousand people. Oh, wow. I mean, Jersey's the most densely populated state, and Bergen County is the most densely populated county within that state. So it was intense. The majority, I'm not sure where Lisa's parents are from, but the majority of the kids I grew up with, their parents all came from either the outer boroughs of New York or the west side of Manhattan. And they were predominantly Irish, Italian, and Jewish, almost all. And it was, there was a decent amount, like one of my closest friends to this day is Cuban. So there was, a decent Hispanic population. It was, decent Asian population. It was relatively diverse, probably more diverse today.
Yeah, her parents came from Bergenfield by way of Queens. I think her grandparents were from Queens.
Exactly. So you're right. It wasn't her parents, and it was her grandparents. Right.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
But most of that area, very few friends of mine had parents that grew up in New Jersey, originally, or their whole families came from New Jersey. Most came from New York City.
Yep, no doubt.
That's awesome. I'm always really jealous of people who grew up in such a melting pot, because you probably had a lot of exposure to all different kinds of foods. I mean, just different religions in general. I'm from a very small town in Virginia where we don't have any of that diversity. So it's like to think I lived in New York City for a few years. And when I would meet someone that said they grew up there, I couldn't comprehend that. I'm like, wait, so you were raised in New York City? It didn't seem like anybody, it couldn't soak in.
Yeah. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Even my mom. So my mom is of Italian descent. She grew up in a pretty dense Italian neighborhood in the Bronx. But her best friend as a child growing up was Jewish. So my mom picked up, some dishes and stuff from her girlfriend and her girlfriend's family. So I grew up eating things like matzo brie and whitefish and stuff like that, certainly my parents weren't Jewish at all, but I think just those things, just like a lot of Italian dishes became New York food. It wasn't looked at as a different ethnicity. It just became part of the New York canon of food. And everyone knows it and appreciates it, no matter what your specific background is. If you came from New York, you know all that stuff. You ate at delis all the time. You ate pastrami sandwiches just as much as you ate spaghetti and meatballs.
Yeah, my mother-in-law is Sicilian, full-blooded Sicilian, and
Right.
apparently she stopped cooking when I met Lisa.
That's perfect timing.
Yeah. So how old were you when you knew you loved food?
Oh, really young. I mean, I was lucky in that, I'd said earlier, my parents owned this 4-family house. So in 1975, my mom's parents, who were living in the Bronx, came and moved to the apartment downstairs from us. So at 5 years old, I had my Italian grandparents essentially living with me and as built-in babysitters. So not only did they cook and I ate their food all the time, but I would spend weekends with them. My parents would go away for the weekend or go out on Friday, Saturday nights, and I would be with my grandparents. And, from the time we woke up in the morning, I think we started preparing food in some way, grating cheese they would grate their own cheese, make their own breadcrumbs, make their own pasta all the time from scratch, and peel garlic all day. And it was just like normal stuff. Clean squid. I mean, I seriously have cleaned easily an ocean's worth of squid as a child growing up.
I've never cleaned a squid.
So I was pretty entrenched in it early on and appreciated it. When I was a child, 6, 7, 8 years old, I mean, until my grandparents passed away, every Sunday and I'm an only child, so this was not like me and my brothers and sisters getting to hang out. This was my parents, my grandparents, and myself would sit down at about 3:00 in the afternoon at the table and knock it up till about 8. I'm not kidding. It was many, many courses. And this was every single Sunday without fail. Unless it was a holiday or something, there's something else going on. It was Mother's Day, perhaps that didn't happen. But other than that, every Sunday.
Wow,
I love that.
Well, hey, go through the courses if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. So it would always start in the afternoon with my grandmother she'd make the meatballs. So what she would make on Sundays was called gravy. And it's known as gravy really only in the kind of New York area. And it seems like an odd thing to call tomato sauce, but it's a really very meat heavy sauce. So I guess that's where it came from. I'm not quite sure, honestly, who first started calling it gravy, but it's known as gravy. So Sunday gravy would start in the afternoon with my grandmother just always putting aside a little bit of the ground beef from the meatballs, and she'd make these tiny ones and fry them up in some olive oil and then give them to me as like a little snack on toothpicks. So that was usually the first course, like pre-sitting down. And then the first course was pasta. Usually that was it. The pasta would come out. If it was handmade, it was usually cavatelli. If it wasn't, it was usually the long fusilli, that kind of is like spaghetti length but curly, or maybe rigatoni. And after the pasta was done, then all the meat that was in the gravy would come out. So sausages and meatball and braciole, any little bits of meat that were left over from the week went into the gravy. Usually, meats that stand up to braising well, things like that. My grandmother would always put something that nowadays is very difficult to find, but cotina, which is essentially just pigskin that would get seasoned and rolled up and tied up just like the braciole, and that would go in the gravy. And that was the best. That's so unctuous and delicious, and it would add a lot of great flavor to the gravy, but also just eating that. It sounds really kind of gross eating pigskin, but trust me, it's like soft and it's really good. So that would all come out, and that was a lot. That was a lot of food. When that was over, There was usually a little bit of a salad of some sort. And that could be something more like a traditional salad that we all know of, right? Of course, it was always just olive oil and red wine vinegar. There was no, dressings beyond that. And then sometimes it could be like shaved fennel and some orange slices and things like that. Often she would do something that, again, seems a little kind of odd, but she'd do orange slices with olive oil and salt and pepper on them. And that was sort of like a little bit of a palate cleanser. Then there would be coffee and nuts, usually. Actually, kind of before the coffee came, the nuts would come out. There was always a big thing of mixed nuts, often walnuts. And that was always to like eat up, maybe with some cheese and some stuff like that, to finish whatever wine was left at the table, basically. My grandfather would often crack the walnuts and put them in his glass of wine. And then sort of, at the end, eat the wine-soaked walnuts out of the glass. And then coffee. And coffee was always accompanied with usually a little bit of chocolate. If it was a pastry or something, it was nothing too sweet, nothing, Italians, they'll eat sweet stuff for breakfast, but they're not really a big dessert culture. So they're even, they might be like some sesame cookie or something, that's like sweet, but not really sugary sweet. And then there was always, for the adults, there was always anisette or sambuca or something with the coffee. And that was it. But these courses, like, coffee alone could be an hour and a half of just, pot. They would make a manganetta, which is if you're not familiar with it, it's sort of the upright cylindrical pot that goes on directly on the stove.
Oh yeah.
And kind of percolates through. So it was espresso, but nobody had espresso machines back then.
Right.
And the whole pot, the whole manganetta would sit on the table. So yeah, coffee alone could be an hour and a half,
And you sat as a kid. You sat through the entire.
I sat there. I mean, certainly at the end of it, I was fidgety, and there were, I'd probably get up between courses a little bit, and maybe do something for a minute or two, but not much. It was a lot of just sitting there and hanging out with the adults and talking.
And no cannolis.
Rarely, unless somebody came over and stopped at like a pastry place and bought them. No. If it was just like what my grandparents had, that was almost always just some chocolate, like some dark chocolate. It wasn't like a big spread of desserts. So unless there was company or, other people came and brought that. Every now and then my grandmother or my mom or somebody would make a Italian cheesecake. So there might be that there, or like some Italian cookies, strufoli, which are the tiny little like dough balls that are covered in honey. But these are not like the sexiest of desserts by any means, especially for a young kid. You're sort of like, meh.
Yeah. And I feel like as an only child, I'm an only child too. I was always around adults. It would be like my parents or their friends who are also obviously adults. And so you kind of learn to become amongst the adults quite often, rather than all of my friends who would always have siblings running around to play with and stuff. So you kind of adapt to that. Yeah.
No question. I think it definitely, helped me mature a little faster and helped me, I think, be a better conversationalist, and all of those things contributed to it. No question. That was the upside of it. I think it wasn't until I got older when I realized, like, it wouldn't be the worst thing to have a brother or sister.
I feel the same way. And people give only children a hard time. Anytime I tell anyone I'm an only child, I get the same reaction.
Of course.
Oh, you're one of those.
Mm-hmm.
I just assume you and Joe are very selfish, Katie.
Exactly.
That's what people always think. I'm here to change everyone's opinion.
All right, so let's talk about when you're 30 and you moved back with your parents. What happened next?
So, it was a confluence of many things. So shortly after this company went under, in January of 2001, by September, we all know what happened, right? So that really threw a wrench into everything. And my wife, or like I said, we weren't married at the time, but she was working for, she has actually a really great classic internet story of the day of the companies that she was working for. She first started at a web design company, started by these two kids, again, fresh out of college, young. One was the child of two very famous architects. So he had a little, money to play with. They were successful. This is back when, designing a website cost $20,000 or something, because nobody knew what the hell they could do. And but then, they made a lot of really dumb mistakes. They were about to get bought out by a much bigger company in the UK, and they stopped getting new work because they figured, we're on the road to Easy Street. We're going to get bought out for all kinds of money. And then the dot-com bubble crashed, and they retracted the bid. And now all of a sudden these guys were, kind of stuck with a lot of debt and no income, and the company went under. They had a spin-off company, though, called Thin Air Apps, that did wireless applications, mostly for RIM, for BlackBerry, and for Palm Pilot and that kind of stuff. Remember Palm Pilots?
Yeah.
I do. I don't think the other two do.
I do. I've read about them.
So that company, that was another great situation. So she was a controller for the company. She went when the web design company went under. She was brought over to the wireless applications company. They were given an offer by Palm, actually, for, I don't know, something like $20-something million to get bought out, and these guys turned it down, thinking, "Oh wow! In a few years, we're going to get triple that." Post September 11th, Palm wound up buying them for something closer to like $12 million, and it was like barely enough to cover their debt.
Wow!
So just like classic, .com stories. So anyway, she was now out of work, getting great unemployment because of sort of like what's going on now. The government was, giving all sorts of extra unemployment benefits. I had an idea for quite a while, because I had gotten into craft beer by like 89 or so, like just out of high school. I had stumbled upon one night on the original Discovery Channel. And that's another thing. If you're not old enough to remember, the Discovery Channel, A&E, Bravo, these channels were very different channels to what they are today. They played much different programming. It was much more serious programming. I mean, Bravo was all foreign films, and same with A&E. You could see like the opera on A&E, and Discovery Channel was like real documentaries, and like they would show BBC documentaries all the time. And I stumbled upon this BBC documentary on beer by a guy named Michael Jackson, not the guy with the glove, but this other kind of long-haired, bearded, crazy English journalist. And I was never a big fan of beer. I don't know, it never like tasted good to me. I always kind of thought it sucked. When I remember we were in like maybe freshman year of high school, and a friend of mine was having a party, and I convinced them, instead of getting a keg of like Budweiser, to get a keg of Tuborg Dark. And there was Tuborg Gold and Tuborg Dark, because I figured like at least dark beer seems like it has some flavor, Yeah. Of course, everyone hated it, and I loved it. But I stumbled upon this documentary, and I was fascinated by it, absolutely fascinated by all of this history and all these little nuances in beer and distinctions in beer and beer culture and the different beers from Belgium to Germany to the UK, and stuff I knew nothing about. And anytime I kind of get excited about stuff like that, I don't do it in half steps. I'm always like full on, like anything I can possibly get my hands on. I want all the information immediately. And that's kind of how I took to beer. I went to the library, got every book I possibly could on beer. Homebrewing was kind of a little bit of a thing, but it was still fairly obscure. You still really had to search out places that you could buy homebrewing equipment and supplies from. There was this one place in Manhattan, in Soho, that I went to, called Milano Labs, that I wish was still around, because you walked into this place and it was absolutely like time machine going back in time. It was incredible. This like kind of old spice store that was like, looked like it was out of, the mid 19th century. And I started homebrewing. Certainly by 1990, I was homebrewing. And my first beer, I had said earlier, I grew up cooking a bit. So and brewing is very much like cooking in many ways. And beer is very much like food. The ingredients that are in it, also, the whole process from roasting the grain to brewing the beer, it's much more like cooking than winemaking is, let's say. So I took to it very quickly, and I had decent success with my first beer. It was a brown ale, and I remember thinking, this is good, nice, but like, I don't know, I could go to the store and buy a really good brown ale. What do I need to buy, brew my own brown ale for? So that was the last conventional beer I ever brewed. Every beer I brewed after that was just something completely off the wall, which, funny how it goes. It wound up taking another almost 20 years before that became a norm in beer, but it certainly did become a norm in beer where, using really strange ingredients and putting weird things into beers became a norm. But I was doing this by like 90, 91. I was malting my own amaranth to make a beer out of amaranth. I was putting cocoa powder in beer. I did a lot of beers that I fermented with wine yeasts and other, non-beer yeasts, and a lot of fun doing stuff like that. And some were absolutely wonderful and some were terrible. But it was much more fun, even making a terrible beer, experimenting and learning and doing that than just brewing, another IPA or another pale ale, or, it's like, I could go to the store and buy that. Who needs that, So it was really fun. And that sort of got me into craft beer. So all through the early 90s, I was passionate about craft beer. I'd find craft beer wherever I could. And, I had a bunch of friends who were into it. And I always had this idea in the back of my mind to do a craft beer bar the way I thought a craft beer bar should be. Not at the time, all craft beer bars were, any bar that had any cool beer was essentially just like a crappy dive bar or a sports bar or something like that just also happened to have craft beer. They usually were not places I was terribly interested in hanging out. Certainly not a place you'd take a date or your wife or girlfriend to. It was kind of like, meh, not exciting. And when I first went to Europe and saw these kind of beer cafes in Belgium and places like that, I realized, well, this is how it should be. This is much more sophisticated, much more serious approach to it. And it treats beer with a little more reverence. And I felt like great beer should be treated the same way great wine or great anything should be treated, not be a lesser class citizen. So I had these ideas for how I would want to do a beer bar. I'd want it to be a warm, cozy, inviting space. I'd want it to be fairly well lit. I'd want there to be some good, interesting snacks, and I'd want to keep the beers at the right temperature and serve them in proper glasses, not necessarily the branded glasses that the breweries do for advertising, but a glass that's going to show the beer best, mostly wine glasses. But honestly, I was in music. I knew nothing about. I never ever worked in a bar or restaurant in my life at that point, so I had very little knowledge of what that would be. And I thought, maybe this is something I'll do when I retire. I'm in my 60s or something. Maybe I'll open up a little craft beer bar. Well, fast forward to post September 11th. My wife and I are both out of work, not knowing what the hell to do. And I decide, money was cheap at the time, as it is now, right? They were kind of giving loans away pretty easily, tons of credit cards. I'd saved up a bunch of money. One of the reasons why we moved out to Jersey was to put some money aside to buy an apartment back in the city. So I saved up about, 20, 30 grand at the time. And I spent about a year putting a business plan together for this bar. My parents put in a little bit of money. We couldn't get many other people to put up much money. I think a friend of my dad's gave us like $1,000. I think it was more like, here you go, kid, whatever, never expecting anything to happen.
Sure.
And we put a ton of money on credit cards and eventually found the right spot and went for it and opened up this beer bar. And that was my first place. That was Spite and Dival. And that was in September of 2003. Excuse me. And we knew fairly quickly that we were onto something, that this place was going to do well. And that sort of is how everything kind of got started.
That's awesome.
Were you serving food? Or was it just
beer? We do. So we have to, in New York State, as probably a lot of places, you kind of almost always, depending on, now there's a lot of different liquor licenses in New York State that you can have, but almost all of them require some sort of food be served. So at the very least, you needed to sell potato chips or pretzels or something. We did something at the time, which I rarely ever saw. We did charcuterie and cheeses and some really interesting pickles and things like that. Now that's commonplace, but at the time, very few places were doing anything along those lines. And it's fun. It's funny to think in a relatively short period of time how, something can go from seemingly groundbreaking to sort of like boring.
You were ahead of the times.
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, yes, no question. And we were certainly ahead of, timing and luck have a lot to do with all of this, and I think life in general. And, though there had been this craft beer movement, like I said, starting in sort of the late 80s, early 90s, it had faded away by the end of, by the turn of the current century. It was there, but it had become like, in the background, just kind of on simmer. And there was just, kind of the beer geeks that were into it, and that was that. So we definitely timed it a few years ahead of what became now the current insane beer culture that we have today. So we were lucky in that sense. We definitely were ahead of that curve, no question.
That's fantastic. What is your favorite beer to this day? Like, if you're going to have a beer, what do you go grab?
I would say 9 times out of 10, it is probably a really great German Pilsner.
Okay.
Because it's the most pleasurable drinking beer when it's just to drink a beer. I generally, and I would say this wasn't true when I first got into beer, and I have a little bit of a theory as to why this happens. But, when I first got into craft beer, I gravitated to the complete other end of the spectrum of anything that I would have known resembling beer prior to that, right? So everything I knew of beer growing up was sort of Miller Lite, right? That kind of thing. So I wanted barley wines and stouts and things like that. Belgian doubles, big, rich, malty, powerful, alcoholic beers. But eventually it kind of got over that. And I think most people who have gotten into beer and wine have made that same sort of trajectory from power and intensity to subtlety and nuance. It's much more difficult to brew a really great Pilsner than it is to brew a good barley wine or imperial stout. It takes a lot more brewing skill. Nothing to hide behind. No hops or alcohol or, malt sweetness or any of that to hide behind. And, let's face it, I generally, people would ask me this question when I was working behind the bar all the time. What's your favorite beer? And so much of it is, what time of day is it and what time of year is it?
Sure,
honestly, is it 4:00 in the afternoon or is it 4:00 in the morning? And is it, January or July? I'm going to reach for a different beer in all different cases. So that has a lot to do with it. But I would say, generally speaking, it's on the lighter side. And I like low alcohol beers. I like, I definitely like sour beers, things that have like some good acidity to them, because that's kind of the quenching quality. Mm-hmm. I've always been a huge fan of lambic, traditional lambic, real lambic. We've always been, major supporters of true lambic beer. So that's generally my favorite stuff.
All right, before we leave beer, do you have a favorite Hefeweizen?
Funny thing is that's probably my least favorite type of beer.
That's my favorite.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
It's something, and it's not the wheat. I like wheat beers. It's the yeast in particular that those wheat beers use. To me, there's a flavor, a kind of clovey kind of quality that I don't love. It's probably the beer I would drink the least, and in my life have drunk the least.
So you have a very sophisticated palate. I do not.
No, look, it's a very quenching beer and people love it. There is a beer by George Schneider, a German Bavarian brewery, called Schneider Edelweiss, which is the closest beer to the original Oktoberfest beer. And it's a bit hoppier but German hops, not American. So it's not, when I say hoppy, it's not going to taste like what we think of as hoppy beers now. But I would say that's probably my favorite of them, if I had to pick one of that style.
I'm writing this down, Joe.
Okay.
Taking notes.
Yeah. Schneider Edelweiss.
Got it.
Next time we do a podcast, I think we should all have one.
We should. Well, we're sharing this one.
We'll share
It's
it.
all good.
I want to taste it too.
So,
I don't really know anything about beer, so this is enlightening for me.
So, Joe, you're at the beach right now. Are you at the shore?
I am, yeah.
And do you live in the city or do you live in Jersey?
I live in the city. I live in Brooklyn.
Okay. Oh, so you live, okay. Got it.
What part of Brooklyn?
In Williamsburg. Actually, I'm kind of right on the Williamsburg Greenpoint border in North Brooklyn.
Okay. I lived in Bed-Stuy for a few years, like 2012 to 2013, 14, and then lived in Clinton Hill for a while. And then the last year that I lived in New York, I lived in Staten Island, but I tend to leave that part out, the forgotten borough.
Nice. Staten Island.
Nothing like taking a ferry to work every day, especially when it's 8 degrees outside.
I'm sure.
It wasn't
Wild.
too bad, though. Yeah.
That's a rarity. I got to say, like, to not be from Staten Island and move to Staten Island, that doesn't happen much. That's a very small percentage of the people who live in Staten Island.
Yeah, I get that a lot. And it was for a guy, and it didn't last long. And then after that, when the relationship fell apart, I think it was a mix of I live in Staten Island, my relationship just fell apart, I'm moving back to Virginia. And so I just left.
So funny.
As fast as I could. Yeah. No, I think if I never moved to Staten Island and I stayed in Brooklyn the entire time, I think I probably would have stayed in New York a lot longer. But I think that was the beginning of the end, Staten Island, which should maybe be the motto for Staten Island.
Yeah, at the beginning of the end, no question. It's interesting because of rents in the last, 20 years. So many people that I know now who have moved to New York for the first time immediately moved to Brooklyn. For me, Brooklyn was where you went to after you lived in Manhattan for a long time, or something like that. So I lived in Manhattan for a decade before I ventured out to Brooklyn. But yeah, now you move directly to Brooklyn. Nobody goes to Manhattan anymore. It's just too expensive, and it's also, quite frankly, like not where the cooler stuff is happening anymore.
Right. Yeah,
it happened for quite a while.
So much great stuff about Brooklyn. Just endless stuff to do, like weekends, going with your friends to like Smorgasburg and just eating everything in sight, and then taking like a 3-hour nap afterwards because you've spent like 4 hours eating ramen burgers and drinking beer and getting sunburn.
Pretty great.
It's pretty great. Brooklyn's awesome. Is Williamsburg your favorite?
I guess so. It's where I am. It's where I've been now for 16 years or whatever. I think Williamsburg, it's changed. Certainly in 2005 when all the condos started getting built, it changed the complexion of the neighborhood. And certainly what Williamsburg was over the, from the 80s up until say 2005, 6, 7, 8, somewhere around then, it's not that at all anymore. All the cool kids, all the artists and musicians and all that, they're in Bushwick, they're in Ridgewood, Queens. They're not in Williamsburg. They can't afford it. It's just much too expensive. It's it's very expensive. So Williamsburg, unfortunately, look, it is what it is. And I tell people all the time, New York does not care about your nostalgia. New York just doesn't give a crap. It moves and it steamrolls over everything. And get over it. Is really what comes out there. You're wistful for the old neighborhood, reminiscing about the old days of the old diner that used to be there, or the old bar that, like, move on. New York's not your town. New York just doesn't care, man. Money is what drives New York, and all else has to succumb to that. So
I love those old photos of the subway with all the graffiti in it, where it's just it looks like a completely different transit system than it does today.
It's funny. So many people get kind of wistful for that too. Like, the way it used to be in the 70s or the 80s, and that was real New York. And I tell you, man, like, I was a kid, but still, it was not cool. New York was dangerous. It was shady. It was dirty and nasty, and like. I don't like that it's gotten a bit more homogenous, and I don't like that it's gotten more corporate, and that stuff sucks. But I also like that, the murder rate is down to what it was in the 50s.
I'm sure.
You know what I mean? Like, I like the fact that it's safe and clean and nice, and I don't long for the 70s in New York. There's aspects of it I think that were wonderful and incredible, but generally speaking, it's just like, it might be wonderful to have lived in the 20s or the 1890s, but there was no antibiotics, and people died of cholera,
right.
So it's always nice to look back on things, but generally speaking, things are better today.
I remember going up there as a kid in the 70s, and after being there about a day, I looked at both my parents. I'm like, why are we here?
Well, when I first moved to New York and I moved to Bed-Stuy, and when I would meet people who had lived in New York City their whole lives, they were like, you would never live in Bed-Stuy like in the 90s or 80s.
Oh God, no. Yeah. I had friends who lived in Bed-Stuy and in Fort Greene in the 90s, and they would joke that their exercise was running home from the train station. When they got out of the subway, like running home, basically. So
yeah,
to avoid any problems.
Yeah, now it was.
Not
I
like
mean,
that anymore.
no, they've got like great restaurants there. It's for the stories of what I've heard of the past is far different than the Bed-Stuy that I knew in the 2012-ish.
Yeah, no question. No question. Very different.
So you're in the craft beer business, and then did that give you the taste of owning your own place and wanting to move into more of a restaurant field instead of just focusing on beer?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, I didn't have a background in the bar restaurant business. So I, for better or worse, was able to avoid some of the, I think typical pitfalls that people who are either, a maitre d' or a chef or somebody like that and opens their own places fall into. So I wasn't there working. I mean, I worked behind the bar of my first place for the first 3 years because, I had to in many ways, but I wasn't compelled to be a bartender. I wasn't compelled to be a chef or anything like that. And I didn't have experience doing it. Although I knew how to cook very well, I was never a chef. I never worked in a kitchen, a professional kitchen. So I realized that, though we were making very good money at the bar, we could make more money if we had more places. And I also got to a point after 3 years, I kind of stopped working behind the bar because I had enough employees. We were doing quite well. And that first year was fun. It was, hey, I'm making a bunch of money and I don't have to work. I get to do whatever I want every day. And then kind of got boring. And I kind of got fidgety and was like, I want to do something. I had gotten into barbecue in a really kind of circuitous way. I got into barbecue in New York City, which doesn't happen, especially back in the 90s. I had a friend of mine who was a Jewish kid from Connecticut, so it's not like he was, somebody from down south, who I went to college with. And he took me to a place called Brothers Barbecue that was on just off Houston Street. I forget exactly what street it was on. And I had pulled pork for the first time. And it was Carolina, like North Carolina style barbecue.
And my favorite.
When I grew up, my dad had a friend who was a dean at Rutgers University, but he was this Puerto Rican guy who would do these like Puerto Rican pig roasts every summer. And we'd go to a bunch of these every summer. And I felt, as a little kid, I fell in love with this, like the taste of slow cooked pork, which just like, and the crispy skin, but that really delicious, unctuous pork that cooked for 14 hours or 18 hours, And when I had pulled pork for the first time, it reminded me of that. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. I love this. And like I had said earlier about craft beer, over the next couple of years, dove headfirst into barbecue, reading what I could about it at the time. There wasn't a lot. There was no internet to go to. And I didn't go down south often, but anytime I did, I would try to find as many legendary barbecue places as I could and make sure I ate them. Sometime shortly after college, I went to Home Depot and bought like a $40 bullet smoker, kept it at my parents' in Dumont. And every few weekends I would go back and try ribs, try brisket, try pork, and give it all a shot. And I think because I had a bit of background in cooking and I knew what it should taste like, and I had success early on. And in fact, the dry rub recipe that we use at Fette Sau to this day is based on the first dry rub I ever put together.
Oh, wow.
It's essentially the exact same recipe. So I took to it pretty quickly, and I really fell in love with it. And by the time we had opened the bar, I had now been to many legendary barbecue places. I had been barbecuing for a bunch of years. We would actually close the bar every 4th of July for the first few years we were open, and I would stay up all night making pork shoulder and brisket and ribs and all this kind of stuff for everyone. And it was a lot of fun. And I had jury duty one day. I remember it was really warm day in February, but I had a little bit of a cold, and I came back and I went to this coffee shop around the corner from our place where we were living, which was right next door to my bar at the time. And the guy who owned the coffee shop, who opened up like just a few days before we had opened up our bar, so we became pretty good friends, told me, hey, the garage across the street from you is available for rent. You should go take a look at it. So I go over there, and it's this big triple lot with a giant open space in the front where they had cars and 3 separate garages. And I go and I look at the space. It's this old Italian guy, moved to America in 1970, and wound up buying a bunch of property. And I mean, some of these immigrants who came over back in the 70s and 80s moved to Williamsburg and bought stuff for buildings for $10,000, $50,000, wound up selling it for millions.
Wow.
So it's great, kind of great American story, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so he had this space. His son-in-law had a metal shop in there, metal fabrication shop in there. And I took a look at the spot, and it was really raw, cinder block garage, kind of a mess. Not terribly big, but big enough. And I didn't know I wanted to do barbecue. I had a handful of ideas of potential things I could do. But when I saw the space, I realized this is made for barbecue. This is the quintessential barbecue location. And it's funny because when I told the guy what I was going to do there, I think he looked at me like I was out of my mind. Like, are you going to put a restaurant in here? Are you nuts? Like, and I probably was. I think had I known a bit about what it was going to take, and then there was a hazmat restriction on the place through the city, so I had to get an environmental study done on, to make sure we weren't poisoning people and all sorts of stuff. But yeah, I found the spot and decided, all right, I'm going to do barbecue here. It's perfectly suited for it. I knew I could make good barbecue. Although I got to tell you, I was a little freaked out because I didn't know how to run a restaurant of any sort, any food service stuff. We did cured meats and cheeses at the bar. That was simple. A bartender just sliced it on a meat slicer, cut it with a knife, and put it on these wooden kind of planks to serve. It was very basic and simple. Even that, I remember, it took me a week or so to like swallow that pill and do it, So the entire time we were building out this place, I remember telling everyone like, well, we're really just gonna be a bar that happens to have some barbecue, which was a complete lie, but it got me through it. But I definitely woke up many a morning back then in a bit of a panic state, thinking, what the hell am I doing? I don't have a clue as to what I'm doing. How can I be doing this? And wound up having to get some partners involved, some friends, 2 friends of mine who put up some money, which actually made me more anxious because, well, I had no problem losing my own money. I didn't want to lose somebody else's money though. But a couple of things that happened, I think, while I was working bartending and opening this place up, and my kind of head down doing the work, the internet blogosphere kind of blew up, and the food blogs and all that stuff had kind of blown up. And based on nothing more than a blurb by Florence Fabricant in the New York Times saying that Joe Carroll, who owns Spite and Dival, is opening a barbecue place. The first night we opened, we sold out of everything. There was a line out the door, and we sold out of everything by 8 o'clock at night.
Wow.
So we realized, like, oh, okay, take it a little more seriously.
Were you the head chef initially?
No, I knew I was never going to be working there in that capacity. So I wound up finding there was a regular who came into the bar all the time, who was a cook at Pearl Oyster Bar. And he was young. He was 23 or 4, and he was from Baltimore. And I trained him over the course of the, 10 months or whatever prior to opening, how I wanted the barbecue done and how to do it and all. And he was great. He was a great hire at the time because he was young. In the first few weeks or months that we were open, it needed a lot of attention. He would sleep there on the table some nights. To do things like brisket and pork shoulder take, like I said, anywhere between 14, 18 hours. So it's quite the process. So he would spend many a night there until we got everything the way we wanted it, dialed in.
That's incredible. I actually, when I lived in New York City, went to Fette Sau, and that was probably 2014, and there was still a line down the block. I think I waited for like 45 minutes to get in.
Great.
And then I got the tray, and my oh my God, I was like, I'll have a half pound of the brisket. And then just went down the line. By the time I sat down at the table, my friends were like, are you
10 pounds of meat?
I remember getting eating pretty much all of it. So it was, I don't think I had barbecue in the couple years that at that point that I had lived in New York. So of course, when I heard about it, we went there immediately. Being from Virginia, barbecue's huge. So it was awesome. Yeah, it was a great experience. It was super cool.
Awesome. So, always good to hear.
Now you've expanded to other cities too. So how do you manage, cross-state? How do you even approach that? Or
so I'm very lucky. I have an incredible partner who is much bigger, much more successful than I am, who I initially did another Fette Sau in Philadelphia with. And a little over a year ago, about a year and a half ago, we opened St Anselm, which is kind of my steakhouse-ish place in DC together. So he operates it for me. So I don't have to worry about the operation of it. I have ownership, and I was responsible for the execution of the place to open it. But after that, they sort of take the reins over and operate. It's really more his employees running it than they are mine. I mean, they work for me technically because I'm an owner, but they're the operating partners.
Gotcha. So like a dream team.
It's pretty great. I couldn't imagine doing it another way, honestly. It just allows me to really not worry about the details. It also allowed me to not have to take my best people from New York and move them other places and remove them from where I needed them in New York.
Yeah.
Because you're still operating in New York.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's go back to Fette Sau's, your restaurant. You're operating it. Talk about a typical day for you back then.
So I'm relatively hands off. I mean, my approach has always been find the people I work with best, find the people I know who can execute my vision, find the people I know who will do a good job, and really empower them to do that. So obviously the first few weeks, anytime I open a new place, it's much more intense for me. I need to be there a lot, and I need to be on top of it. But once things get up and running, honestly, I can go weeks without popping my head into Fette Sau.
Oh, wow.
Which is funny because I could often be across the street rather, at my other places all the time and not go into Fette.
Oh, wow.
Mostly because I hate coming out and stinging like smoke for the rest of the day. But it really, at this point, I just manage my top maybe 4 people, and they really do the rest. And I'm more focused on, new ventures, opening new places, and my normal day-to-day is very easy, unless I'm opening a new place, and then it's nonstop. Then I'm full on, every moment from the time I get up to the time I go to bed, like entrenched in that world, which I love, though. That to me is the best of it. The creation and execution of a new restaurant is, if I could just do that, I would be so happy. Once they're open, I'm sort of not interested anymore. I mean, not that I'm not, but it's much less exciting, much less interesting.
Right.
Well, your trend has been going south, opening restaurants. Richmond's just south of DC.
Yeah, I think you should put that next on your list.
That is true.
Such a huge part of your restaurants are the concepts. How do you find inspiration for these concepts? Is it like traveling? You mentioned
it's everything. I mean, I'm a great lover of American culture and history, so I really gravitate towards any sort of cultural sort of phenomenon that we've had in this country, food-wise, or sometimes outside of food. But obviously, because I'm in the food business, that's the more important thing to me. And I'm just a great lover of Americana and all of that stuff. I'm also, a fairly creative person. So to me, that's what gets me excited and gets my juices going. And that's what, once I get an idea, man, I can, sit and just sink my teeth into that and really flesh it out. And I'll draw inspiration from anywhere and everything I possibly can, no holds barred. And, sometimes it's based directly on something I may have seen or experienced. And other times it's, some weird amalgam of different ideas that I've put together, and, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. you know? And it's sometimes, though, I'll be honest with you, and this is maybe a weird thing to hear someone say, but I am often just as happy to do a new place that fails as I am to do one that succeeds, because it's, like I said, it's the doing it that is exciting to me. So I've had a handful of failures, and I'm not happy that they failed, but I was happy to have been able to at least execute that project or that idea and see it come to life.
Yeah,
and that, yeah. So that to me is great and exciting. And I've actually probably left a fair amount of money on the table over the years by not following the money, but just following my creative instinct and what was going to make me happy instead of what was going to make me richer. I probably should have opened many more Fette Sau's shortly after we opened the original one. But to me, that I wasn't interested. It was boring. I just did that. Why do I want to do it again? I want to do something else I haven't done. So I didn't. And, I probably didn't make a lot of money that I could have had I done that, but so be it. That's the way it goes. And what wound up happening is lots of other people opened up other versions of Fette Sau.
Yeah.
So
does that bother you, or are you honored by that?
I mean, no. I think if anything, I think it's pretty great. I think it's cool. I mean,
flattering.
I rarely look at myself that I've had much impact on anything, but I think that's one of these weird things that I jokingly call it hipster barbecue, but it's sort of this phenomenon that has happened in the last decade or so across the country and into Europe now, in great ways in Europe, in many countries in Europe, where there is this new kind of movement of barbecue that for a while was happening more in the North than the South. Now it's happening just as much in the South, but a very different approach to it. I love the old barbecue places, but if we're being honest, a lot of them, made their desserts and their sides out of boxes, or it was purchased in some way, and they weren't really paying attention to the details beyond the smoking of the meat. And they really honestly weren't paying much attention or giving any care to the meat itself that they were smoking, where it was coming from, being sourced, how it was raised, any of that stuff. And I think if anything, that was what we brought to the table, and we were really the first to have done that in using heritage breed animals, using animals that were raised with no antibiotics, hormones, or steroids, trying to support small family farms whenever possible, making everything from scratch. Blue Smoke was probably the first as far as making the sides and stuff more serious. But the problem I always had with Blue Smoke, although I thought they did a great job with the food, was the environment, the atmosphere. It was weird to be in the place with white tablecloths and eat barbecue and a big menu. I also come from this belief that great barbecue is served by itself and not with hamburgers and French fries and chicken fingers and tons of other stuff like that. It's like a barbecue place serves barbecue, period. And you do something and you do it well, and that's all you do. I also don't think, in my view of barbecue, that sides should play as big of a role as sometimes they play. I think they should just be a supporting role. And I generally like my barbecue sides to be really crisp and bright and acidic, to kind of cut through the richness of the barbecue. I never got doing like mac and cheese with barbecue. To me, that was just like fat on fat, richness on richness. Never quite made sense to me. So, we've definitely had a bit of an impact on that whole world. There are at least half a dozen barbecue places in London, and I don't know that would have existed if we didn't do what we did, how we did it, when we did it, all that kind of stuff. Now, somebody else probably would have come along and done it anyway. It's not that I think I had some inside track to it, but we just got there before some others. That's all.
So, Joe, a vegan walks into Fette Sau.
Right.
What do they eat?
Pickles, sauerkraut, broccoli, potato salad.
I'm asking because I don't know if you saw his chin go up in the air laughing. Daniel's a vegan.
Gotcha.
Yes, sir.
Well, I got to tell you, especially early on when I was there more often, it was not uncommon for people to stop me while they were there eating and telling me that they had been vegan or vegetarian for X amount of years, and this was the first meat they had eaten in, a decade or 5 years or whatever it was, and how much they loved it.
Daniel and I are coming to Fette Sau in Brooklyn, and he's gonna have meat for the first time in years.
If I were ever to give up the vegan lifestyle, I think I would do it in a manner like that at a place like Fette Sau.
There you go.
Nice.
Well, I'm not sure what made you become vegan, but certainly the provenance of the meat we carry, should help quell some fears if that's part of it. So, the meat we serve at all my places is, very strict protocol. And we will never veer off that. We actually were asked to do concession at the Barclays Center, where the Nets play. And that was a very interesting process because I got to really learn why, a hamburger costs $17 when you're at a baseball game. But at the end, we couldn't make it work because the meat we purchase is simply more expensive than commodity meat. And the sandwich, like if we were to do a pulled pork sandwich, it was going to be honestly $22 or something. And they said, look, we just can't do this. Can you use commodity meat? Then we'll get it down to a reasonable price. And absolutely not.
Yeah.
No way.
So at what point did you make that decision? Because that's a tough decision to make, because if you follow the money, it would make more financial sense to just use commodity meats.
Yeah, honestly, it came down to this. I don't want to eat commodity meat, so I would never serve someone else commodity meat. It's that simple. I struggle enough with the impact that cattle in particular are having on the environment. So to support a factory farm where it's really at its worst would just be the worst thing I could do. And, I think it's the flip side to that is how great it feels to support a small family farm.
Right.
And so we deal with a lot of times, it seems odd for a restaurant, especially a restaurant that goes through, quite a bit of product to purchase from these small family farms. But usually the way it works is kind of comes through like a broker who will purchase from a bunch of different farms, small farms, and then sell it that way. So I'll deal with some farms that might have 300 heads of cattle, and I'll deal with some farms that have 6 heads of cattle. That tiny,
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Well, Daniel, do you want to keep going on the vegan thing?
Well, I'll just say, yeah, I think the main reason, there are a lot of reasons that I went vegan. I'm still vegan. And one of the main ones is like the place to where we've gotten with factory farming and the way that its effect on the environment, its effect on people's health, its effect on the animals. No question. And so it's easier for me to think black and white, which is why I just decided I'm just going to go full on vegan. And I've been healthier and happier for it. But I do think that like the only path ahead lies in a return to like small scale distributed small farms, like the ones that you patronize. So I think it's very cool.
In the short term, I think that is absolutely the way to go. In the long term, and I don't know how people feel about this at the moment, my guess is not terribly great, but I think we'll all get over it. But in the long term, I think lab grown meat is where we're headed. Laboratory produced meat.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Look, there's no way we're getting the planet to become vegetarian, let alone vegan. It's simply not going to happen. So, and we're not programmed. We're omnivores. Look, the reason why we're humans is because we not just ate meat, but we cooked meat. But it plays a very important part of our development as humans, our brain development, all of that, right? It's programmed in us to love and appreciate meat. You're not going to get the world off of meat. However, we can't continue down the path we've been going down with these factory farms and producing cattle. I mean, it's so intense to, just to produce meat from one head of cattle. The energy that has to go into that it's terrible. So really the only way around that is to not have cattle and still have meat. And doing it in the lab is the only way we can make that happen. It's happening already. It's not widely available by any means. There's a company in California that's doing it with tuna at the moment that are selling to just a very few select sushi restaurants. At a molecular level, there's zero difference between a steak grown in a lab and a steak grown on a cow. So, when you eat it, I don't think there's any way of knowing one way or the other where it came from. I think mentally it's a little weird for people, but I think, we're a very adaptive species. We'll get over that,
Have you ever tried lab produced meat?
I have not. No. I will say I'm incredibly pleased at these new burgers and the new kind of vegetarian meat that's been produced by Beyond Meat and all of that stuff. By far the best shot at making fake meat that we've had so far, no question. It's amazing how close they've come. But a couple of problems with that, right? One is it's fine when we're doing burgers, but if you want a T-bone steak, how is that going to work?
Right.
And the other is, nutritionally speaking, it's actually worse for you than eating an actual burger. So that's not really helping much, right?
Right.
So that's kind of the bummer about it. So that's why I think at the end of the day, we still have to have meat, actual meat. But the only way to do it without having that impact on the environment is to grow it in the laboratory. We do it actually. Again, it's in infancy stages, but we do it for human organs. And basically, you're just getting the lattice of whatever it is. If you wanted to grow a human heart, you basically wash off everything but the protein lattice that you can grow the meat on, and then just slowly over time you grow those cells, those protein cells. It's kind of fascinating.
Oh, it's tremendously fascinating because I had no idea that was even a thing.
No, me neither. You're blowing my mind right now.
Yeah, pretty incredible.
Imagine where we'll be 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah.
What the state of things will be.
Look, if we can produce the meat that we produce, or at least most of the meat we produce now that way, think about the positive effect that will have on the environment. So
yeah, amazing effect.
Yeah.
Huge. All right. So there's no way to easily transition to this. We ask a question of most of our guests in every episode. And since we haven't heard a lot from Daniel, I'd love for Daniel to tee it up.
Sure. So the question is, as a 25-year-old, if you went back to that point in your life and you didn't have any responsibilities, would you rather have gone into the military or made a stab at becoming a full-time stand-up comedian?
No question, I would have made a stab at becoming a full-time stand-up comedian.
I can see that.
Yeah, I can see that too.
Scare the shit out of me, but not as much as being in the military.
That's great.
There's not a lot of guests who say that. Mostly everybody says military.
Really?
So yeah, you're one of
them. No,
them.
I would rather you amputate both my thumbs than me going into the military.
That's a very strong stance.
That's the strongest answer we've gotten. Yeah.
It might
not that I have anything against the military. I'm all for the military. I'm just not for me personally.
Right.
No, I get it. And one of the differences for some people, and they don't say this, maybe you can join the military and you don't really have to think that much. If you're a comedian, you're thinking all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you have to set yourself up for pretty, embarrassing failure pretty often. And it's
you do. There's no question. You have to be okay with failure, and you have to have a thick skin. I think I have a pretty thick skin. I think growing up in Dumont contributed to that thick skin. And I'm okay with failure. I think. Look, that said, I think having success prior to failure helps. I think it's a lot easier to get through the failure when you know you've been successful in the past. But I feel like in anything you do, if you can't be okay with failing, sometimes you're gonna struggle. You're gonna have a hard time. You're never always going to be perfect. It's impossible. No matter what you are or what you do, you're gonna fail, and you got to be okay with that. And I've had plenty of places that opened and did not succeed, and I realized I could have had a couple of extra vacation homes for the money that I lost, but so be it. I mean, nothing ventured, nothing gained, right?
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
What's your best lesson you learned from failing?
Well, I don't know that it's a overarching lesson. I think it's lots. I think that you always learn more from failure than from success. And so I had mentioned earlier that I never worked in the bar or restaurant business. Not completely true. My only experience ever was for about 4 months in 1999. I was in between a couple of jobs in the music business, and I saw that this restaurant called Belgo was opening up on Lafayette Street, just a few blocks away from where I lived. And I knew Belgo because they had first opened up in Covent Garden in London. And they were a Belgian restaurant that served tons of great Belgian beers. And it was but a very modern kind of setting, and aesthetically great look and feel to it. So I saw they were opening there, and I knew a ton about beer, but I knew nothing about the business, certainly the restaurant business. And I went in and asked for a job and said to the manager, I don't know a thing about bartending, but I know a lot about beer. She gave me a little bit of a beer quiz and realized right away that I did know a lot about beer. And she said, look, perfect. We could use someone like you. We have a lot of very experienced bartenders, but none of them know anything about beer. So that was my experience, my only experience in the business prior to opening my own place, was bartending for this place for 3 months. What made it so good is that they screwed everything up. They made all the wrong decisions. Now, they were from out of town. They were from the UK, first of all, not even American. They came into New York with all this bravado because they had been very successful in London. And I think they had a couple of, like 2 places in London at the time, and I think a place in Dublin by the time they came to New York. And really just came with, guns blazing, thought they were just going to take over the town, and New York had other ideas. They were fairly successful for, the first month or so, and, and the PR machine was in full swing. But it died off quickly. The restaurant actually only lasted about 18 months. But in the 4 months I was there, I learned so much about what not to do in the business. And that helped me more than had I worked there and they'd done everything right, I wouldn't have known what those things were that they were doing right. I wouldn't have been able to know the detail of it the same way. Then when it went wrong, I could see exactly where it went wrong, and why. So that helped a lot. But so I do believe that, failure in many ways can lead to success because you learn the right lessons. So it's never one, at least for me, it wasn't one specific thing. It was always little details here and there, that you just don't make those same mistakes again.
True. Great point.
So what's it been like the last couple of months being in Brooklyn? Just very macro perspective, not a Fette Sau or you perspective, but just in general.
It's been weird, obviously, as I'm sure it's been everywhere. I think the toughest thing for through all of this, I should say, is just not knowing what 2 weeks from now is going to look like, or 2 months from now is going to look like. And we didn't know that back in March, and we still don't know that, and that's been the struggle in this, is not being able to think ahead and plan things. And in business, when you try to set some sort of strategy, you want to know what you're working with. What are the rules here? So, we know in the coming weeks, we're going to be able to open up more and more, but we don't know what that looks like and what the rules are to open up, so it's hard for us to sort of plan ahead and forecast anything. It's definitely been strange. We've been lucky. We've been doing fairly well through all of this. But like all of us, what can we do? We sit back, we, bide the time and hope it passes, and hope we get out on the other end okay, I'm
really glad business is doing okay for you guys up there. I assume from afar that things had slowed down to basically a screeching halt.
I mean, they nearly had, certainly the first few days when everything happened, everyone was just, kind of scrambling and trying to figure out what was up, and we didn't know what to do, how to do it. We had always done, or mostly done, delivery and takeout at Fette Sau, never at St Anselm. It's just, look, steak doesn't really show itself best being delivered, especially when you're spending a couple $100s on a giant, 64-ounce ribeye. So we, to do delivery there was never an option we never wanted to do delivery there. Plus it's a small place. We were always so busy. We just didn't have the bandwidth to do it. Well, obviously when this happened, we had to rethink things, and it took about a week to get set up with all the delivery apps and all that stuff. But it's been okay. We've been doing pretty good delivery and takeout at both places. My bar at Spite and Dival, the beer bar, has been closed. We just opened this past week for the first time since the shutdown. Just to do what's happening now, is I'm sure it's happening in other places, is, people are coming up and buying stuff at the door or the window, and then basically standing out on the street corner having a drink.
Sounds great.
And, yeah. And the younger, the younger that sort of demographic skews, the more people are doing it. So, the bars that cater to 23, 24-year-olds, they're doing fairly decently. But we've been okay. I wasn't paying my full rent to my landlords initially. I was just giving a portion of what we thought we could, I wanted to give them something, but we weren't paying them everything. Once we got our PPP from the government, that took care of that. So I was able to make them whole again. Going forward, I'm not sure how it's going to look rent-wise with these guys. I think they're going to have to make some concessions. We're clearly not going to be able to do our full business for probably a good handful of months. And who knows if this thing kicks back up again. I mean, that's the problem, as I stated. Like, we just don't know. We don't know if a month from now things are going to be fairly normal again, or if a month from now we're going to wind up being all stuck back home.
Right. Yeah. The uncertainty of it all.
Yeah.
Yeah. That it's so strange, because I'll hear all these, you watch the news and it's very sensational, and you're hearing about all these deaths and cases, but then I'll go to the grocery store and I'll have my mask on, of course, but there's more people there than there usually is. And right. I feel, or like there's this hole in the wall Thai place that I'm obsessed with near my house. And anytime before all this happened, we'd go in there, there's maybe one other table besides us in the restaurant. And then once, this all happened, they were doing takeout. So I went to go pick it up, and they just had hundreds of bags of takeout behind there.
Sure.
Took like 20 minutes to find which one was mine. So I'm thinking, it's so strange how it affects certain things. And they didn't do takeout before. So I'm wondering if going forward, they're like, well, we learned that we do fantastic business takeout, whereas we had 2 tables on any given Saturday before.
Mm.
Yeah.
Do you have a decent idea? Or it sounds like you probably don't, but do you have an idea what the world will look like a year from now for your restaurants?
No idea. But like I said, based mostly on, we just don't know how this is going to play out with the virus, right?
Yeah.
Or the government for that matter. But I don't know. I don't think, as some people do, that this is going to change how we live forever in many ways. I think that everyone wants to get back to normal. There's no question. No matter where you're from, what you do, everyone wants normalcy again. We're social creatures. So I think that's what's killing all of us the most, is just not being able to be social with our friends and family and everyone, just going out and doing what we do, right? And it really seems like at roughly the 2-month mark, most people were, no matter how they felt, how freaked out they were about the virus, or how much they thought it might have been a hoax, everyone at about 2 months was like, all right, I'm done. I need to see people. I need to go out. I need to live my, and it's true. I get it. It's, for better or worse, there's almost no way around it. It's in our nature. I don't know how it's going to look in a year. I do believe that as long as we don't really break the economy globally, meaning that, like, this doesn't kick back up again and everyone's got to go back in for another bunch of months, the summer economy gets destroyed. Like, we're certainly teetering on with the economy here. Things could get very ugly if this lasts a lot longer. As long as that doesn't happen, I think things will come back very quickly, because everyone wants it to. I think there's going to be a certain percentage of the population that really got their ass kicked in this, and there's going to be no way around that. And that's unfortunate, but that's just how things go. And it's a shame, but if it wasn't this, it was probably going to be something else. That said, most people, regardless of their income, want to get back out and spend money and do things and go to restaurants and go to bars and go to movies and do all that stuff. So I think the recovery should be relatively quick. I see it. Look, we decided to start selling some of those big axe handle ribeyes that we do, that range anywhere from, on the low end, in the 30, 32 ounces, on the high end up to like 84 ounces, let's say.
Wow.
We sell them. We actually lowered the price a little bit for $3 an ounce. So you can quickly do the math and realize these are not inexpensive cuts of meat. These are very expensive. We decided to do one case. It's on about 8 steaks, and we sold out immediately. People coming, picking them up, and taking them home. Now, how long will that last for? How long are people going to spend money on expensive steak that they got to bring home and eat and all that? I don't know. But people want to spend money. People want to get out there. They want to do things. There's no question about it.
Very cool. Well, Joe, I really appreciate you joining us. You immediately said no problem, and really great talking to you. Really good hearing your story, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been awesome. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to subscribe through whichever app you're using. To share your thoughts, head over to our website at podso1.io, and there you can comment on episodes or send us feedback directly. Thanks for listening.